Tonight on Nation of Nation, an NDP MP says Conservative accusations that his party has abandoned Indigenous hunters by supporting a revamped gun control law are completely false.
We have a much better bill moving forward, and it's a bill that targets criminals now, and manufacturers and importers, and upholds Indigenous rights.
The president of the Métis Nation of Ontario is disappointed with some of the negative attention a new self-government agreement is attracting.
Our agreement is about protecting our children. It's about protecting our families. It's about governing ourselves. And it, as I said, it doesn't impact on any other people.
An Indigenous Leadership Initiative official says it is no surprise First Nations people are increasingly involved in environmental protection.
It's the Native people of this land that are the ones that are feeling the direct impacts of climate change from coast to coast to coast.
Welcome to Nation to Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. There's been a lot of discussion about guns on Parliament Hill lately, or more specifically, which guns should be legal and which ones illegal. The Liberals were forced to retreat from amendments to their Bill C-21 gun control legislation a few months back after a number of groups, including Indigenous hunters, spoke out, saying they would ban rifles they currently use. Revamped bill was announced earlier this month, but the legislation is still being hotly debated. NDP MP Peter Julian sits on the Public Security and National Safety Committee, and he joins us today here in Ottawa. Thanks very much for joining us here to talk about Bill C-21, Mr. Julian.
It's great to be with you.
Okay, so I guess with the latest changes, can you tell our viewers which rifles or guns would be banned for Indigenous hunters and which ones wouldn't?
None of them. Quite frankly, what the NDP did when we had the Liberal amendments that were put out at the end of last year with no consultation with Indigenous groups at all. There was quite an outcry, very valid. The government hadn't consulted, and so the NDP got to work and we forced the withdrawal of those amendments. Now what we have is a Bill C-21 that is refocused. Rather than law-abiding hunters and farmers or Indigenous people being targeted, it is very much focused on criminals, particularly around the use of ghost guns, and making sure that manufacturers and importers actually carry responsibility. As you probably know, the law is very porous when it comes to manufacturers and importers. They can basically classify their firearms on their own. It's like an honor system, which is ridiculous. So what the NDP wanted to see is three things. First off, refocus on criminals who are using untraceable ghost gun weapons, and that is an epidemic that is increasing exponentially in some parts of the country, 100% a month. Secondly, ensure that manufacturers and importers those loopholes were closed and that we had to classify those firearms appropriately. Thirdly, ensuring Indigenous peoples would be consulted at all times. That's why we pushed for a renewal of the Firearms Advisory Committee that would include Indigenous representatives, and ensuring as well, as Laurie Idlot has talked about, and Leah Gazan and Blake Desjardins, Indigenous members of our caucus, we needed to ensure that those rights were protected, Section 35 rights, and so that will be debated tonight. I expect that that will pass, and that will mean that nothing in the bill will abrogate or derogate from Section 35 rights for Indigenous peoples.
Right. So, as you know, the Conservatives came out very hard against this legislation as it stands now, the latest changes. They say it's actually worse, and they're accusing parties like yours, the NDP and the Bloc, of abandoning voters in the rural and northern constituencies. What do you have to say about that? It's
completely false, and they know that. The Conservatives have been working actually quite constructively to improve the bill, but they are very aware that it doesn't take away existing firearms, that the military-style assault weapons in the future, this is a loophole that manufacturers and importers have been using. What they've been doing is introducing new models. That loophole will end. But it doesn't impact Indigenous hunters now. And that was something that the NDP pushed very hard. We wanted to ensure that the sort of catastrophic confusion that happened with the Liberals tabling amendments without consulting Indigenous peoples, that was stopped. And it was the NDP that forced the withdrawal. The Conservatives made a ton of money fundraising off it, but did nothing in the House of Commons to actually assure that those amendments would be withdrawn. And they did nothing to ensure Indigenous peoples had continued to have access to their rights. So the Conservatives have been playing a game around this for fundraising purposes, but it is false to say, when you look at the bill, and anyone who has, I have a number of legal firearms owners in my community that looked at the bill, they look at the amendments, and their reaction is, why are the Conservatives trying to mislead people?
Right, and now I know this is a controversial issue for many people. It's urban, rural, there's many, but maybe speaking from even in your own area, like Burnaby and in Vancouver, a lot of people very fearful of what's going on in the United States. They see the availability of guns, they're worried about that here. They see the manufacturing industry is powerful, as you know, and they just don't want to see any chance of semi-automatic weapons being available in Canada, or to limit that. Now, some of these voters, people that are in urban constituencies, they know the Conservatives play politics with this issue, but they might kind of maybe now be accusing your party and the Bloc of sort of maybe doing it a little bit too. Like, what they might say, why not have as comprehensive a list of weapons as possible, semi-automatics banned, and then you can work back rather than working the other way to maybe allow some of these weapons to fall into the wrong hands?
Well, Liberals and Conservatives have fundraised off this bill, and I think both of them have been acting in their own interests. The NDP has been the adult in the room, which is where we ensured Indigenous rights being maintained. It's where we ensured that there's the consultation process, because part of the problem with the amendments that were tabled at the end of last year was the fact that there was no consultation with Indigenous groups at all. They just, Liberals threw them out without consulting. And we've said to the government, moving forward, you need to have people from Indigenous communities around the table so that any discussions around classification is done with full consultation. And so that's something that the NDP fought for, and something that the NDP has achieved. The minister has announced that he'll be reconstituting the Firearms Advisory Committee, including with representatives from Indigenous peoples, also farmers and hunters, and from groups like Police Souvienne that are advocating for stricter approaches on firearms. So what that does is provide consultation and consensus. The way the government did it at the end of the year, the Liberals simply fell far short from what is their obligation, which is that duty to consult. They did not do that. And that's why the NDP was proud to force Jagmeet Singh and the entire caucus. We forced the withdrawal of those amendments. That's a good thing. We have a much better bill moving forward, and it's a bill that targets criminals now and manufacturers and importers and upholds Indigenous rights. That's the kind of bill I think most people can get around, and that's why I think the NDP has been the adult in the room through this whole process.
Right. Yeah. If any. I know there's been lots of discussion, and at times hasn't been very adult-like. So good point, I guess. If they, that's probably what people want to get back to. But we're gonna have to leave it there. But thanks very much for joining us today, here, Mr. Julian. We know you're busy, and we know this committee work is probably keeping you very busy well into the evening, as you were saying. So thanks very much.
Good to be with you. Thanks so much.
Next up, we'll have Métis Nation of Ontario President Margaret Froh talk about the self-government agreement the organization has signed with the federal government. Welcome back. Earlier this year, the Métis Nation of Ontario signed a self-government agreement with Ottawa. The MNO says the agreement only confirms rights Métis people already have, such as the ability to run their own political affairs and pass bylaws that affect their people. But some Ontario First Nations say the agreement is much more than that, and it will infringe on their treaty rights. These First Nations have launched lawsuits against the federal government over the agreement. Joining us today to talk about all this is Métis Nation of Ontario President Margaret Froh. President Froh, welcome back to Nation to Nation.
Thank you very much, Fraser. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Great. And so I guess I do have to ask you, first off, I know you signed the agreement back in February, and you probably want to talk a bit about that, but what we've been getting is a lot of this sort of controversy that's been happening in recent weeks, you know, what the self-government agreement means to First Nations. There's been lawsuits, and calls for it to be withdrawn by Treaty 3 First Nations here in Ontario. So what's your reaction to all that, sort of the latest news this is generating?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question, Fraser. So I think actually it is important to back up a little bit to explain that. Our Métis Self-Government Recognition and Implementation Agreement, our self-government agreement that we signed in February, was actually one that was signed after 6 years of negotiations. And it came after an MOU in 2017 that created exploratory discussions table, a framework agreement to establish a formal negotiation process that we signed in December of 2017. A self-government agreement in June of 2019 that was big news. And at each of those steps, we have very publicly celebrated this, and that at no time did any Indigenous legal community take action against our reconciliation journey with Canada and with the Crown. So it's and these are significant. You know, when we signed the Métis Self-Government Agreement in June of 2019, we weren't alone. We signed alongside our sister Métis governments from Saskatchewan and Alberta. It was the first time in Canada's history that the federal Crown acknowledged a Métis right of self-government and self-determination as recognized and affirmed by Section 35. And it's been almost 4 years now since that initial agreement was signed. And so it's a bit of a surprise that we're seeing this call now. I think it's important to talk about what the agreement does and does not do. So first, let's just talk about what our self-government recognition and implementation agreement does. So when we signed that agreement in February of 2023, Canada officially recognized the Métis Nation of Ontario as the Indigenous government for the Métis communities that we represent. The recognition is only between Canada and the Métis Nation of Ontario. It actually doesn't impact anyone else. It has no impact on First Nations. It has no impact on Inuit. It doesn't even impact other Métis governments. And it also does not have address in any way harvesting or any land-related rights whatsoever.
I guess I have to ask you then, based on that and what you're saying, are you a bit disappointed on some of the negative reactions that are coming forward now and the press this is getting?
I am disappointed. I think, our agreement is about protecting our children. It's about protecting our families. It's about governing ourselves. And it, as I said, it doesn't impact on any other people. And I don't understand why anyone would want to oppose us having a say over how we take care of our children, as an example. So I do find that very troubling. And we absolutely believe as Métis that we have no role in how First Nations govern themselves, how they protect their children. And likewise, they should have no role in how we govern ourselves and protect our children. I will say, and I've been saying this consistently, we should be sitting down and talking about this as Indigenous governments. The MNO would always welcome meetings with any Indigenous community with concerns. Some of the ones that are stepping forward with concerns, they're communities that we do have relationships with, and without talking to us, taking this position, it is disappointing. We should be meeting on this. And at the end of the day, our communities have been around for a very long time. They're not going anywhere, and we shouldn't be wasting our money on lawyers and the courts. I've said this for quite some time now. Reconciliation isn't just about Indigenous peoples in the Crown. It is also about reconciliation within and among our own Indigenous nations too. I think court cases like this may make lawyers rich, but it certainly doesn't help our citizens and it doesn't help our communities. So our door is always open. We aren't going anywhere. And I do hope that the few First Nation leaders that are taking this position will take us up on that offer to talk so that they better understand what this agreement does and what it does not do.
Okay, and we're just going to quickly play you a clip from Indigenous or Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Mark Miller earlier in the week when he was asked about some of the calls by First Nations to reject the agreement. And here it is.
And the last thing we want to see is Indigenous communities being pitted against other Indigenous communities because of actions that Canada took in the past. So it is a complicated space to navigate in, but that comes with a corresponding obligation to be speaking openly and freely with the Indigenous communities that feel they are affected.
All right, and so you heard from what he said. He said clearly, it appears Indigenous people being pitted against Indigenous people. Now, as you know, this has happened before. But isn't kind of does the federal government have a role to play here to maybe communicate the agreement better or to make sure this doesn't happen? Because that kind of appears on the ground. It's kind of, again, this First Nations against Métis people sort of fighting against each other.
But I would agree with Minister Miller. This is these are actually times when we should be celebrating the successes and certainly not being pitted against each other. And oftentimes when it comes to Indigenous issues, we see they get more attention when there's conflict, as opposed to the opportunities to tell our stories in a positive way, like the story of Métis self-government. The minister also went on to say, and Canada has a duty. It has a constitutional obligation to work with the Métis and to respect our inherent rights of self-determination and self-government. This current media frenzy, if you can call it that, that's being advanced by some First Nation chiefs, it really goes to deny the very existence of our Métis communities. And these are communities that have and have been recognized as having rights protected under Section 35 of our Constitution. And those have been confirmed by the Supreme Court of Canada. In fact, the very community that was responsible for that watershed Métis rights decision, the Pali decision, is being questioned as well by some of these leaders, arguing that the Pali test isn't being applied, ironically. And to deny the existence of Métis communities and other Métis communities in Ontario is unconscionable. We need to be sitting down. We need to be talking. We definitely need, as your point, we definitely need to be educating.
Right. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Very interesting topic, of course. Lots to talk about, but we're a bit short on time. But as always, a pleasure, and thanks for joining us today, President Fro.
Thank you for having us, Fraser.
Up next, we'll have Frank Brown of the Indigenous Leadership Initiative to talk about the First Nations Land Guardians Conference going on in Ottawa this week. Welcome back. Indigenous people are increasingly taking leadership roles in environment and climate change movements. One of the organizations they're getting involved with is the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, or ILI. The ILI is taking part in the National First Nations Guardians meeting taking place in Ottawa this week. Frank Brown is hereditary chief of the Heiltsuk Nation in British Columbia, where his traditional name is Gladly Aslia. He's also a professor of environmental management at Simon Fraser University and a senior advisor with ILI. Frank Brown joins us today in our Ottawa studio. Welcome to Nation, Mr. Brown.
Thank you.
All right, so as we were discussing a bit earlier, what exactly is the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, I guess, and what's going on at this conference this week in Ottawa?
So the Indigenous Leadership Initiative is supporting nationhood amongst First Nations in Canada, specifically supporting Indigenous guardians and the establishment of Indigenous protected and conserved areas as critical biodiversity conservation areas to support the mitigation of climate change. Specifically, what we're doing is helping Canada to support its international commitments to 30% biodiversity conservation by 2030. Those objectives won't be achieved if the First Peoples of this land aren't involved in protecting both land and water to ensure that we have a way forward in the face of climate change.
Absolutely, and I understand that the First Nations Guardians program is a big part of that, and I understand it's growing as well. Can you maybe tell me a little bit about what that program does? I understand it's people on the ground or boots on the ground that are doing this.
Yeah, thank you for the question. We have supported the growth of Indigenous Guardians in Canada over the last 5 years. The Guardian program has grown from 30 programs to over 120, and they're the eyes and ears on the land to gather critical data that will inform the stewardship and conservation of Indigenous territories from coast to coast to coast.
Right, and I guess what we've noticed over the years, and you've probably noticed it too, is there's a real movement of Indigenous people, and particularly young people, getting involved in climate change initiatives and having their say in protecting the environment, not just in Canada but worldwide. What do you think? Why do you think this is happening, particularly right now, I guess, at this juncture?
Well, if you take a look around, It's the Native people of this land that are the ones that are feeling the direct impacts of climate change from coast to coast to coast in the north and in the Atlantic, and I come from the Pacific coast. You know, we're dealing with ocean acidification and the oceans warming, and how it directly impacts us is the effect on fish, seafood in particular, such as salmon and herring. The Pacific salmon has collapsed, herring is collapsing because they're cold water fish, and they depend on cold water to survive. And we go the way the fish go, and in turn the ocean. You know, 70% of the planet is covered by water, 20% by fresh water, and it maintains the equilibrium for our ecosystem. So it's imperative that we do everything that we can to protect both water and the land, because without that we cease to exist. And young people recognize that. They're the ones that are going to be dealing with the brunt of this and want to do whatever they can. We support them on the land, support through providing resources. We've lobbied to basically help fund the Guardians to gather this critical information to make informed decisions around climate change mitigation.
Okay, and as you're aware, some of these activities have produced some conflicts. I'm sure you're familiar with wet'suwet'en issues there, and also even the LNG pipeline, sort of in BC as well. There's First Nations groups, bands that support it, others that don't, and sometimes it puts Indigenous people in conflict with each other. Where do you see maybe the resolution to this is, so that maybe Indigenous people are more united, or it doesn't put them on one side of the issue or the other?
Well, I think it really comes down to UNDRIP implementation. In British Columbia, the province of BC has legislated UNDRIP, has made a commitment of over $200 million to support its implementation, and in the next 3 years have supported an $8.9 million co-creation of Guardian training programs, so that we can gather the necessary information to inform strategies to mitigate capital projects. Our people aren't necessarily opposed to economic development, but I think what we aspire for is more of a conservation-based approach that is more sustainable, that will ensure that there is something there for our future generations. And the Guardians are an important part of that work to make sure that that information is gathered so leadership can make an informed decision about where major projects go. That's a very important conversation that we need to have. And in order to achieve free, prior, and informed consent, you have to have the information.
Right, yeah, there's a host of issues happening, and things too many to almost keep track of these days. So. But I guess we're going to have to leave it there. But thanks very much for joining us today, and thanks for coming to Ottawa, and enjoy the rest of your time at the conference.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to share the important and critical work of Guardians across Canada from coast to coast to coast. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Great, our pleasure.
Yeah.
That concludes this week's episode of Nation to Nation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcasts at aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Fraser Needham. Good night.